Most killers get caught because they make mistakes, but every once in a while, somebody doesn't. A true perfect murder is rare, but it does happen. Whether that comes down to luck, investigative failure, or true genius at work is up to you to decide, and that's what we're looking at today. Hey guys, it's Andrew. Thanks for tuning in to Scary Mysteries. Here are 5 insane cases that didn't break. Number 5, Tinley Park 5.
17 years later, it remains one of the most infamous cold cases in the Chicago area.
It was mid-morning on February 2nd, 2008, when a routine Saturday at a suburban women's clothing store turned into one of the most chilling unsolved crimes in recent American history. At Lane Bryant, at the Brookside Marketplace on 191st Street near Harlem Avenue in Illinois, 6 women, a mix of employees and customers, were corralled into the back room under threat of a gun. When the smoke cleared, 5 were dead, and 1 was left wounded but alive. And the person responsible walked away totally scot-free. On that morning, the store should have been just another small shop in an otherwise busy strip mall. It was a place where women came to shop for clothing, not expecting anything more than the usual bustle of a weekend. Around 10:45 a.m. though, the calls to 911 began pouring in. Police and paramedics were dispatched to the scene after reports of shots being fired. Within 3 minutes, officers arrived to the unsettling scene. At the back of the store, 5 women were shot dead, execution style. A 6th, a part-time employee, had survived with a single graze wound to the neck because she instinctively turned her head at the last second. The victims were 4 customers: 34-year-old Jennifer Bishop, 37-year-old Connie Woolfolk, 22-year-old Sarah Zamfransky, and 33-year-old Carrie Chuiso. The 5th was the store manager, 42-year-old Rhonda McFarland. Each woman had shown up that day for her own reasons: shopping, work, errands, none with any inkling of how the hours ahead would unfold. According to the survivor's testimony, the suspect walked into the store posing as a delivery driver. He then ordered everyone toward the rear of the shop and bound their hands with tape before opening fire. At least one of the women was SA'd during the encounter, though authorities have not publicly identified which victim was involved. In the chaos, store manager McFarland was able to call 911 just as the violence escalated.
911 emergency. Stay on the line.
And that call brought help rushing in, but by the time officers and paramedics arrived, the gunman had already fled. Even in the first days after the murders, investigators knew this would be an unusually stubborn case. And the cameras in the store mainly faced the front entrance, so there was no usable footage capturing what happened out back. The Tinley Park Police Department released a sketch based on that survivor's account. A black man, between about 25 and 35 years old, roughly 6 foot to 6'2", with cornrowed hair and a distinct braid with light green beads, hoping someone would recognize him. Despite hundreds of tips and an early $100,000 reward offered for information leading to an arrest, well, the trail just went cold. The Tinley Park investigation grew into a multi-agency task force involving the Illinois State Police, FBI, and the Will County State Attorney's Office. They applied evolving forensic techniques and persistent lead follow-ups, but no suspect was ever identified or charged. So in the end, the evidence is clear on what happened inside that store. 6 women bound, 5 of them executed, an attack that likely began as a robbery. But it says nothing about why someone capable of such a crime has never been identified in 18 years. It is that absence of closure that defines this case. Despite modern investigative tools and public appeals, the person who stood over those bodies and walked away has never been brought to justice. Number 4, the church lot. On January 12, 2010, a 55-year-old mother of three drove to an evening prayer service at St. Paul on the Lake Catholic Church in Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan. It wasn't a late night out, and it wasn't a risky place. But by the time police started looking for her, her SUV was sitting in the church lot like she'd stepped away for a moment and never came back. Joanne Romaine lived in the Grosse Pointe area and was known to keep close ties with her children. That Tuesday night, she attended a prayer service, but what happened next has been debated for years. The starting point either way, though, has always been the same: her car abandoned in the church parking lot. When authorities searched the SUV, they found personal items inside, including her purse and her wallet. From there, police soon reported they located footprints in the snow, a single set, leading away from the area toward the lakefront. Their early conclusion formed quickly. Joanne must have walked on down to the water for one reason or another and sank beneath the surface. That theory immediately ran into a hard reality, though. Lake St. Clair in January is freezing. The shoreline is cold and uneven and often iced over. The search efforts began, but Joanne wasn't found that night. Days passed, then weeks, and the longer she stayed missing, the more the case stopped looking like something that could be wrapped up with a single explanation. And 70 days later, in March of 2010, Joanne's body was discovered in the Detroit River system near Canada, found by fishermen in a channel. By way of the water, this is 40 miles from where she would have entered. That distance and time span became a major point of dispute, but police maintained their position that she entered the water near the church and was carried by currents until she surfaced much later. Well, her family didn't accept that. In interviews over the years, Joanne's children described their mother as frightened in the weeks before she vanished. They pointed to a tense family conflict and claimed Joanne had singled out a male relative in a warning, saying that if anything happened to her, they should look at him. That detail became one of the most repeated elements in coverage of the case because it suggested Joanne felt like someone was out to get her. Long and ongoing family rift over inheritance that was boiling up to the surface. And then there were the physical details they believed didn't fit. In one widely reported account, the family questioned how Joanne could have navigated the shoreline conditions in the footwear she was wearing, and they pointed to damage on her purse and bruising noted after she was recovered as signs that something else may have happened before she entered the water. Her body was also not as decomposed as it should have been after 70 days, but the dispute here is that cold water can slow that process. So all these concerns eventually became part of a larger fight, not just over what happened to Joanne, but over how the investigation was handled in the hours that mattered most. The family pursued civil litigation, alleging misconduct and a cover-up involving local departments. But in court, the case ran into the same wall the public keeps running into: proof. There just isn't enough evidence pointing to one thing or the other. Does it make sense that Joanne, a church-going woman in good health with a loving family, would choose to walk into the icy cold waters that night without leaving a note or any other warning signs? No, not according to her family. But does that mean that an angry relative grabbed her outside her church that night and threw her in the water? Again, no. Joanne walked into a church service on a winter night and then vanished from a parking lot. Her body was found weeks later in a different country's waters, and two competing narratives have been locked in place ever since. One of them asks you to believe this was a private decision made in silence, and the other asks you to believe someone found a way to get away with murder. We'll get back to the story in a second, but first I want to talk about something a little more real-life scary: your bank statement. I don't know about you, but every few months I scroll through my card history and find some random subscription I forgot about, or the same thing billed twice through different platforms. Stuff I haven't used in months, just quietly draining money in the background. and that's why I like using Rocket Money. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. Inside the app, you can actually see all your subscriptions laid out in one place. You spot the stuff you don't use anymore, and you can cancel right from the app with just a few steps instead of digging through emails and "Are you sure you want to leave" screens. It also pulls in your account so you can see checking, savings, loans, and investments on one clean dashboard. You can set budgets, savings goals, and get alerts for big transactions or upcoming bills. So instead of being surprised by your money, you actually know what's going on and can make a plan. It's like having a little control panel for your finances instead of chaos. Let Rocket Money help you reach your financial goals faster. Join at rocketmoney.com/scary. That's rocketmoney.com/scary. rocketmoney.com/scary. Number 3. Manson 2.0. In the early hours of February 17, 1970, military police were called to a small home on Fort Bragg in North Carolina. Inside, a family had been brutally attacked. A pregnant woman and 2 young girls were dead. The only adult left alive was the husband, a Green Beret doctor, who claimed 4 strangers had done it. Captain Jeffrey McDonald told investigators that he fell asleep on the couch and woke up to the chaos happening. According to him, a group of intruders, 3 men and a woman in a floppy hat, had entered the home, attacked his family, and knocked him unconscious.
Next thing I knew, I was awakened on the couch.
He described the woman chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs."
And I heard her say, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." I heard her say that more than once.
It was a shocking claim, though in 1970, you have to remember that it landed in a very specific moment in American culture. The Manson murders were still fresh. The idea of drug-fueled outsiders committing ritualistic violence didn't sound impossible. And for investigators on a military base with little experience in homicide, it was a narrative that, at first, explained everything. Inside the home, McDonald's wife, Colette, and their daughters, 5-year-old Kimberly and 2-year-old Kristen, had suffered devastating injuries. Colette had been stabbed dozens of times. The children were beaten and stabbed in their beds. The violence was personal, sustained, and uneven, details that didn't line up cleanly with a fast-moving group attack. But those contradictions weren't fully confronted at the start. The crime scene was mishandled almost immediately. Military police allowed dozens of people to move through the house. Evidence was disturbed. Fibers weren't preserved the way they should have been, and blood patterns weren't properly analyzed. What should have been a tightly controlled scene, instead, became crowded and compromised. And that failure created space. McDonald himself had relatively minor injuries, a small puncture wound to the chest, some bruises and cuts that doctors later described as superficial. At the time, this didn't immediately raise alarms. Investigators were still chasing the intruder story, canvassing for hippies, questioning local drug dealers, and treating McDonald as a victim rather than a suspect. However, an Army investigation eventually turned toward him, but even that fell apart. In 1970, an Article 32 hearing, the military equivalent of a grand jury, concluded there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. McDonald was honorably discharged, and he moved to California, remarried, and rebuilt his life as a physician. And for several years, it looked like the case was over. Civilian investigators and prosecutors continued reviewing the case throughout the 1970s. As forensic science improved, the original evidence was re-examined. Blood typing, rudimentary by today's standards, but more refined than before, revealed patterns that contradicted McDonald's account. And fibers from his pajama top were found in places that suggested it had been torn during the attack, not by intruders, but during a struggle inside the home. In 1979, nearly a decade after the murders, McDonald was indicted by a civilian grand jury. In that trial, prosecutors argued that the intruder's story wasn't just unlikely, it was constructed after the fact to explain away inconsistencies. The defense returned to the same argument that had saved him the first time: investigative failures, lost evidence, and mishandled procedures. Most importantly, those 4 suspects who were never found but also never fully ruled out.
Dr. Jeffrey McDonald, a former captain in the Army Green Berets, is serving 3 life sentences for the murders of his wife and 2 young daughters in 1970.
And since then, the case has never stopped generating debate. Appeals, books, documentaries, claims of suppressed evidence, and alternate killers. To this day, McDonald maintains his innocence, and if in fact his story is true, then the 4 hippies who went on a killing spree that day not only got away with murder, but they also pinned it on an innocent man. Number 2, the axe in the pub. In the early hours of March 10, 1987, a man was found dead in a pub parking lot in South London. He was laying beside his car, his wallet still in his pocket, his jewelry untouched. Embedded in the back of his head was an axe. From the moment his body was discovered behind the Golden Lion pub in Sydenham, it was obvious this wasn't a robbery, a fight gone wrong, or a crime of opportunity. This was an execution, plain and simple. And from the jump, this case started peeling back layers that revealed a much darker and sinister plot at hand. Daniel Morgan was 37 years old at the time, and he worked as a private investigator and lived a bit of a complicated professional life that blurred the line between legitimate work and criminal proximity. Now, he drank at the Golden Lion regularly. On the night he was killed, he'd been there with a business associate, talking about money, debts, and a growing dispute that had started to turn personal. At some point in the night, Morgan stepped outside to the car park, and that's when he was killed. He was struck multiple blows with an axe before collapsing beside his car. Whoever did this knew exactly where he would be and exactly how to end it, and from the start, suspicion settled close to home. Morgan had been in a bitter business dispute with his former partner, a man connected to London's criminal underworld. And that partner had ties to violent figures and, more importantly, to police officers. There was an uncomfortable overlap: criminals, investigators, and law enforcement all operating in the same orbit. And that overlap would define the next 3 decades. The initial police investigation quickly narrowed in on suspects linked to Morgan's work and social circle. Arrests were made, statements were taken, and then, almost magically, nothing held. Evidence quickly went missing. Lines of inquiry stalled. Files were mishandled. Witnesses changed their stories or backed out entirely. By the time the first prosecution attempt collapsed, the damage was already done. Over the next 34 years, the murder of Daniel Morgan would be investigated 6 separate times. And each one promised answers, but each one ended the same way, with no convictions and no accountability. However, each investigation did reveal something interesting, and that was the growing evidence that the failures to solve this whole thing were not by accident. As years passed, allegations of police corruption began stacking up. Investigators were accused of leaking information to suspects. Officers were alleged to have had financial relationships with people connected to the murder. And one detective was accused of accepting bribes in unrelated cases. Another allegedly interfered with evidence handling. And yet every time these claims came close to being tested in court, they fell apart. Daniel Morgan's family refused to let the case fade, though, and they pushed relentlessly for transparency, and their pressure eventually led to one of the most significant reviews of police conduct in British history. In 2013, an independent panel was formed to examine the case from the ground up, and not just the murder, but the investigations themselves. What they uncovered was damning. When the panel released its final report in 2021, it concluded that the Metropolitan Police had been institutionally corrupt in their handling of Daniel Morgan's murder. And not corrupt in the sense of one bad officer or a single mistake, but corrupt in a way that protected itself at the expense of justice. In other words, they could have solved the murder, but actively tried not to. By that point, though, the original suspects could no longer be prosecuted, and time had erased too much. Witnesses had died or disappeared, and evidence was compromised. The door, it had closed. Daniel Morgan's murder had become, in effect, untouchable, which was the point. When someone killed Morgan in a pub car park with an axe, and multiple people likely knew who did it. And yet, after 6 investigations, decades of scrutiny, and a formal finding of institutional corruption, no one has ever been convicted. Number 1. The Michigan Murders. In 1969, Jane Mixer was 23 and in her first year at the University of Michigan Law School. She lived in the Law Quad in Ann Arbor, one of only a small number of women in the program, balancing classes with a serious relationship and plans to move to New York. Her life was just getting going. On the evening of March 20th, Jane left campus with a simple plan: get a ride home to Muskegon so she could tell her parents she was engaged. She'd posted a note on a university ride board asking for a lift west across the state, and it's believed another student had agreed to take her, though no one knows that for sure. Her parents waited for her to arrive and then waited some more, but she never showed. Early the next morning, road workers near Denton Cemetery in Van Buren Township noticed something inside the chain-link fence. On top of a grave lay the body of a young woman. She was fully clothed, her raincoat laid carefully over her, a copy of Catch-22 by her side. The name inside the book and later dental records confirmed this was Jane Mixer. The autopsy showed she had been shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber pistol, and a nylon stocking had been wrapped around her neck. There were no signs of assault, but her pantyhose had been pulled down. The pathologist concluded she likely died around 3 a.m. and that she had not been killed in the cemetery, and someone brought her there and arranged her body like that to be found. And this case landed in the middle of a larger nightmare. Between 1967 and 69, a string of murders of young women around Ann Arbor, later called the Michigan Murders, had already terrified southeastern Michigan. And when Jane's body was found, most people, including investigators, assumed she was another victim of the same unknown killer. When John Norman Collins was arrested later that year for one of those murders, many quietly filed Jane's death under his name, even though he was never charged with killing her. See, the details never fit cleanly. The other Michigan murders involved abduction, essay, and extensive beating or stabbing. Jane had been shot and strangled, and her body carefully staged. There were no witnesses tying Collins to her ride, and no physical evidence putting him in Denton Cemetery. Still, the assumption held, and for decades her file sat in a drawer, technically unsolved, but treated as if it were already explained. In the early 2000s, advances in DNA testing let cold case investigators re-examine evidence from 1969. Items of Jane's clothing, including her pantyhose and the stocking used as a ligature, were then sent to the lab. And technicians recovered male DNA and ran it through modern databases. It did not match Collins. Instead, it matched Gary Earl Lederman.
This is the guy and this is the day. This was just an opportunity for us to talk. I mean, it was the logical next step. We got to talk to the person who deposited the DNA.
A 62-year-old retired nurse from Western Michigan who had never been a suspect and had no known connection to Jane whatsoever. Lederman had lived in the state at the time of the murder, but investigators found no proof the two had ever met beyond the genetic link. Prosecutors argued that his DNA on her clothing placed him with her at or near the time of her death, and used that, along with circumstantial evidence about his movements, to charge him. In 2005, a jury convicted Lederman of Jane's murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. On paper, the case was finally closed. Then, another lab result complicated everything. During the same testing, analysis found a different male DNA profile on a drop of blood on Jane's hand. That profile matched John Rulas, a man who committed a murder decades later. But in 1969, well, he was just 4 years old. He could not have been involved in Jane's death because of that. But still, defense experts and independent statisticians pointed to this as strong evidence of laboratory contamination, arguing that if Ruela's DNA could be transferred onto old evidence, well, so could Lederman's. Courts so far have upheld the verdict, and officially, Gary Lederman remains Jane Mixer's killer. So there was the myth of the perfect murder. 5 insane cases that didn't break. They all had different reasons. And thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please go check out some of our other episodes, because there's a whole lot of strange going on in this world. You all stay safe out there. Watch your backs, and I'll see you over in the next one.